Welcome to The Shadow Knows, a podcast where we journey into the depths of the psyche, mystery, transformation. Hi, I'm Maureen.
Hi, I'm Klara. Together, we explore the hidden forces shaping our lives, relationships, and collective story. In today's episode, we're diving into one of the most vital and misunderstood archetype, the warrior. This powerful energy has been distorted and oppressed in modern culture, yet it remains essential for purpose, protection, and integrity. Joining us once again is James Frazier, Jungian coach, holotropic, and Neo-Shamanic breathwork facilitator, to help us understand the warrior archetype through a Jungian lens and explore what it means to awaken this energy in a conscious and balanced way. James, welcome.
Today, I think we're just going to start with, if you don't mind, those who are new to Jungian ideas. Could you just start in a general way by, in the most general way possible, explain what an archetype is and how these universal patterns show up in our individual and collective lives?
That's a pretty tall order, but I'll give it my best shot. I think archetypes are a little difficult at first to wrap your mind around, but one of the simplest ways to think about them is that they are patterns that shape human behavior, and they're not coming from our personal conscious mind or our unconscious mind. They come from the collective unconscious. So Jung certainly believed that these were energy patterns shaped in a sense how we do things. They also could be thought of as biograms, if you don't like the word archetype, I guess. Internal programming. It's tempting to use technological metaphors of computers, of how you have a system operating in the background. But these archetypes shape how we both think, how we act. However, they remain largely unconscious. We don't know that they're operating in the background, but they are. So there's a way you could also think of them as lines of development. Again, that sounds a little fuzzy, I know, to have those three different things, but if you think about if you were going to build a house, you have a set of plans, and that's the logos for that house. That's what helps build that house. The impetus and energy to build that house and the shape that you build it could be thought of as a pattern, and you're following that pattern, again, either consciously or unconsciously. So archetypes are very powerful forces. They're not like human forces. They tend to operate, again, in the background and unconsciously. However, they can be related to, and we can actually learn to regulate them, which is one of the most important pieces. And one of the things that differentiates Neo-Jungian work especially is the idea that these need to be consciously embodied. They need to be thought about and learned about, and we need to learn how to regulate them, because when they are unregulated, they tend to turn into their shadow form. And the shadow form tends to be the, at best, immature expression of the archetype, and at worst, the pathological expression of the archetype.
Mm. So, James, what I'm hearing you say is that specifically in the Neo-Jungian theory and thoughts, there's a way to approach and work with the archetype, because I feel like the warrior it can be very admired archetype in today's world, and also a very feared archetype. So, what would be the mature approach to this energy?
Well, the first step, of course, is you have to become aware of it. You have to become aware there is such a thing called the warrior. And in my own case, for example, I had been wounded by shadow warriors quite greatly as a child. I wasn't just naturally geared toward warrior energy anyway. And so I had to do some very deep work around getting around a very negative image, which I wanted nothing to do with. It wasn't until I really encountered some of the Jungian and Neo-Jungian work that I began to realize that this was a big piece missing in my own personal growth work. I had done a lot of therapy, I'd done a lot of other kind of work, and I'd actually unconsciously done some warrior work. But when I began to realize that this was a pattern that I needed to work on, it opened up the door. In our culture, mostly what we see are shadow warrior energies. So naturally, lots of people have a real pushback against aggression. They look at things like distortions of the warrior when people act it out in ways of violence or dominance or wars and useless loss of lives. And they think, well, they don't want anything to do with that energy. But every organism, including a single-celled amoeba, has to have some dealings with aggression in your life. You have to be able to be aggressive to get your needs met. Except even the word aggression is now a negative word. And people don't like aggression. They want me to substitute the word assertive. But actually, there are times in our lives when we need to be aggressive. We need to be fully connected to this warrior energy, because the warrior is not just about dominance. It's not just about violence. It's not just about all the other shadow expressions we see of it. The warrior, in its ultimate expression, is about protecting the vulnerable. It's about protecting those who need protecting. It's also about protecting the sacred. The second step is, then it's very helpful if you have somebody who really knows about this stuff, who can teach you about it, and then can help you in your beginning work to try to get consciously connected to the warrior. One of the ways I was disconnected to the warrior was I had a very difficult time asking to get my needs met directly. I had a very difficult time saying no. In other words, I had a lot of codependency kind of issues. So, for example, if I went to a restaurant and I ordered a steak and I ordered it medium and it came well done, I would just eat the steak. I would just figure, well, okay, the chef's had a bad day and I don't want to bother anybody. So, one of the beginning, and it sounds very trivial, but it was actually a pretty big step for me to say, no, you need to send this steak back. It's not done the way I asked for it to be done. Please bring me one the way I asked for it to be done. And then that extended to my pet peeve, which is going to a restaurant with someone expecting to have a nice, enjoyable meal and a conversation and being overpowered by blaring, blasting music. Got to the place of not being willing to put up with that and to ask that the music be turned down. So that those small steps ultimately led me to much bigger steps of trying to embody the warrior. But of course, first I had to learn about the warrior, that it's not just negative. It's not just all these immature expressions. It's not all these pathological expressions. The warrior is, again, about boundary setting, the ability to say no instead of yes when I really want to say no, the ability to have a mission, to be organized. If you're not connected to the warrior, you'll be sloppy in your life. And I certainly was the first third of my life. I saw all discipline as just self-punishment. But it was learning about the warrior and then begin to practice the warrior and also connect with warrior images. So I began to study film, both the shadow warrior in film and also looking for the positive warrior, or especially those films where a shadow warrior develops into a positive warrior. So literature is probably the best place for us to see the warrior energy. And we've been writing about this warrior energy since the first great epic of Homer, written a couple thousand years ago, or more than 2,000 years ago. And we're still doing it today in the form of our modern movie. Some of it, admittedly, is quite distorted, and a lot of what we see are the shadow warrior. I think it was estimated at one point in time the average child, by the time they graduated from high school, had watched something like 44,000 murders on television. Well, it would be nice if we had at least 44,000 acts of positive warrior to counterbalance that. We don't. And so when we look around us, we're not readily available. So you have to do some work, you have to do some research, but you can begin to see this warrior energy play out, especially most easily in film, of course, because drama is life stripped of the minutia and just right down to the archetypal patterns. I had done a lot of work in non-ordinary states, but this was like the other half that was missing. And so in both in terms of my own life and also in terms of the people that I've worked with, it's been one of the most effective models I've ever discovered.
What you just said about the warrior, and for someone who may be completely unfamiliar with this energy. It's the underdeveloped archetype within the psyche. So to start connecting with the energy may just seem so foreign. And when you gave those examples of you asking for your steak to be done the way you ask for it, I can imagine then once one is starting to going against their own old ways, there's going to be something coming in a line within the psyche say, "Oh no, you don't ask for that. You need to stay in those paths because that's what you're familiar with. That's what kind of kept you going all the way up until this point. You don't ask for your needs to be met." Can this be viewed as the shadow warrior manifestation?
What could be, I think this is probably a good place for us to discuss the fact that the shadow has a bipolar aspect to it. There is an active shadow and a passive shadow. So very frequently, if you're not in touch with the positive and you're not manifesting the mature warrior, you're likely doing one or the other, either passivity or overly aggressive. So you get on the one hand the grandstanding bully who just really actually likes hurting other people. This is the pathological version of the aggressive, active polarity of the shadow of the warrior. And then the other one is the passive. This is the person that can't say boo or can't set a boundary and just lets everybody walk all over them. You can be in that position, of course, and convince yourself that you've chosen a very high-browed spiritual path. I'm a really loving, wonderful person. I would never hurt anybody. That may be true, but you're also probably getting hurt, if not from without, maybe from some of your internal things like your inner critic, saboteur. Really have to get over this idea of the warrior being completely negative. If I'm not in doing mature warrior, where am I doing it in shadow? Is a very good question to ask. So if you're, say, a lover type, which is the opposite to the warrior, and you're very loving and kind and very nice person, and you go out of your way to be helpful to everybody, even falling into the trap of codependency, you'll notice that you're likely, a lot of times, your connection to the warrior is in passivity. You give up the warrior. You don't have a connection actively to the warrior. And then you wonder why people are kind of walking all over you all the time. Or you'll let it build up and suddenly you'll explode one day and a lampshade goes flying across the room. And then you wonder, oh, my God, who was that? I don't know. So we all can connect to all of these. It's important to realize, though, that for the most part, these things don't communicate with each other. They're not on the human level. They're just these energies and potentials and patterns. It is up to us to regulate them. It is up to us to learn about them. It is up to us to be conscious of where we're at. Like you could get locked into a kind of aggressive shadow warrior and become workaholic. And you get very anxious when you're not working, but you don't notice that your family life has gone to hell. And you don't notice that you're having all kinds of other problems, but you're just working and working and working. And of course, if you work for a big corporation, they may love you because you're just all the time there and all the time working. As much a possession state as the addicted lover is in the addict. It's just that we don't view it that way. But I think it's really important to make that statement that these things don't self-regulate, don't come to maturity on their own. And ancient cultures had it way over us in terms of this understanding. They knew that they had to do something, particularly in males. Warrior aggression biological thing comes online long before they've had a chance to build a mature, solid, cohesive self structure. With a woman, it tends to come on at midlife after she's had 40 plus years of building that cohesive self structure. So the immature warrior energy plays out mostly in men than it does in women, because by the time most women get theirs online, they've got a lot of maturity already, opposite to what the male has. But these cultures recognize you had to do things to steward these energies. You had to do things to develop these energies. They didn't just automatically happen. especially with the warrior. Most definitely for warrior energy, and why we have so much immature warrior, because we don't do anything in our culture to help people do this. I can guarantee you that almost nobody listening to this video can recall a single class, 1 hour long lecture in their entire experience from kindergarten to high school on how to set boundaries. I bet you can recall hundreds of classes on science and math and sports and everything in between, but not one on how to become a mature human. Not one on how to do boundary setting, which is one of the most important things in terms of human relationships that I can think of. We should have a boundary setting class every semester from kindergarten through high school and maybe beyond. But we don't. We don't have a sensibility about initiation. We don't have a sensibility about eldership anymore. We're a youth orientated culture. We actually see getting old as being if not a crime, it's a mistake. You know, as Richard Pryor used to joke, old people aren't fools. They don't get to be old being no fool. But we don't see them as repositories of wisdom, as guiders of the culture. We see the new hotshots that came out with a great new piece of software. Those are our heroes now. The one who developed a product that made $1 billion by the time they were 23. Those are our heroes. So lacking all of that, we are in a very poor state in terms of this, and thus we see a lot of the shadow side of it. And one way you can see this is in the gang phenomenon, because the average kid that joins a gang is usually around the time that we would associate with puberty, somewhere between 10 and 14 years of age. That's when they join a gang. And of course, there's great payoffs if you live in a really dangerous part of town and you're in a housing project and you're with a single mother who is barely scraping by, and you see a lot of advantages to joining a gang. But they also do a lot of ritual process, and they are absolutely warrior. Unfortunately, it's shadow warrior. It's kind of a cult of death instead of a cult of life. But those young men are sensing they're supposed to be going through something. And when they join that gang, they get a closer brush with initiation. Again, it's unfortunately the pathological side of this rather than the positive side. In ancient cultures, this was one of the most prominent parts of that culture, and everybody's duty was to participate in it. And they realized that if they did not do this, their culture probably would fragment and fall apart and die even.
You mentioned to start to connect with this energy, we need to get to know it. When we get to cultivate a relationship with it, to regulate it. I would like for you to speak a little bit about the importance of the images. And you said your favorite method is connecting to the warrior energy is film and movies. And I know that for some people may just sound, a little woo-woo, but can you speak more about that, like what it actually does to the human psyche and how it's actually going to help to connect with this warrior archetype?
Yes, I will. It appears that images act like sort of connectors and transformers to this energy. So if I have an image of a warrior that resonates for me, it might not resonate for you, but one that resonates for me, and I keep that on my desk every day to remind me that I'm supposed to also be, doing all the things I have to do in life, but I also need to be connected to that energy. That image allows the connection to happen in a faster, much more effective manner. So even if you have an image, for example, when I first start talking about this with a client, often I'll use a movie image that's almost universally recognized and understood. And I'll ask the person, do you remember the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz? Oh, yeah, I remember that. And then I describe the scene when Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Straw Man first come upon this cowardly lion, and he's acting all bravado and he's trying to frighten them, and he's letting out these roars, and they're all shivering and shaking, and he threatens to, he offers to fight him with one hand behind him, and finally he makes a move toward Toto the dog, and Dorothy pops him in the nose, and he just collapses. All that fake persona falls apart, and he starts sobbing, and he admits that he's actually a cowardly lion. It's a terrible thing because lions are supposed to be naturally aggressive. But then in the movie, he actually transforms into a positive warrior. He does several things in the movie to step into the role to get over his being the cowardly lion. And by the end of the movie, they give him the medal, which of course is another image. And now he can proudly proclaim he's the warrior. But it's also the acts that he's done in that movie. Now, everybody remembers that movie, or at least people my age do, because it was shown every year at Thanksgiving. In fact, but you see there the development from the person who's really not connected to the warrior, but is acting like they are. The bravado, macho, bully. And that's really what's behind people who are bullies. They're not really connected to warrior energy. They're pseudo warriors. And they've gone around, they've learned a strategy of making everybody afraid and keeping people away from them. But often when you pop them on the nose, they collapse. We can also take other images, even very negative images of a warrior, and we can learn from it. Like my favorite example of what I would consider to be an immature warrior is the old movie Rambo with Sylvester Stallone. He's presented as a lone warrior type, and he's got his little pocket knife, and he's facing 17,000 of the enemy, and he manages to kill them all. Well, that's just completely BS. It's just total nonsense. If you actually study war and study real warriors ask for help. They want to go with an overwhelming force. They don't ever want to go by themselves. But into the American zeitgeist, cowboy, warrior, loner is built in this image that we have to actually get over. And one of the really important things about practicing warrior is learning to recognize your limits. It's not being self-effacing. That's just recognizing that all of us have limits, and to go past those limits, we need to ask for help. One of the best cultural examples and expression of this, even though you probably won't ever hear them talk about this word, is in the program of recovery from addiction called Alcoholics Anonymous. That's a warrior training program. And if you're going to get in that program and you're going to actually manage to get out from under the compulsion of an addiction such as alcoholism, you're going to have to ask for help. And you're going to have to use other people that are willing to help you. That's the true warrior energy. The idea that I've got to do all this by myself. And I've seen that. I started off working in the field of addictions, and I've seen that attitude kill more addicts than anything. The addict has the attitude, I have to do this by myself. Well, you've already proven you can't do it by yourself. If you could have done it by yourself, you would have already done it. But that's built into our, particularly American zeitgeist. And that's one of the things we have to get over. We have to be willing to ask for help. So when I want to connect with something, if I have an image of it, I'm going to be able to connect to that in my inner psyche in a much, much better way. And so if I find a good image that works for me and I keep it around, even when I have to make a difficult phone call, for example. In my case, I use it's the knight from the famous Lewis chessmen set that's at the British Museum. Mine's not a real one, of course, it's a copy of it. But I have that on my desk, and it's not something I worship. I don't think it has any magic in the figurine, but it reminds me that I need to connect with that energy inside me. And so if I have to make a difficult phone call, I'll be looking at that image the whole time I'm making that phone call. And it helps me connect to that warrior energy. It helps me find the courage to push back past whatever fear I might be doing. This is another thing we need to clear up. A lot of people think if you're really in warrior, you don't have any fear. That's absolutely not true. But courage is having fear and doing it anyway, doing what needs to be done. It's not a fake denial of fear, it's an acknowledgement of fear, but saying, I'm not going to let the fear stop me. So I think one really great way to start this kind of work is for people to go looking for a positive warrior image that they resonate with. Now, I might resonate with a medieval knight in this case. It might fall flat for you. And admittedly, it's harder to find images of female warriors. And we tend to think, of course, of the image of Joan of Arc because she's usually depicted in her suit of armor and actually fighting battles with other men. But you can look at characters, for example, Frances McDermott in a movie called Three Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri. She's not in any battle. She's not shooting any weapons or cutting people with a sword, but she's absolutely in female warrior energy. And you can see, you can find images of a female warrior, somebody who's embodying that energy, and use that to connect to your own image. And then if you really get creative, you can start doing things like create your own image and doing an artwork, a drawing, a sculpture, and that'll even be more powerful. But if you could kind of think of the energy as being almost like a nuclear power plant, but if you're not wired up to it or your fuses are blown, then you can't really make use of that energy. So these images act as the transformer fuse box to get us connected to that.
James Carl Jung once said, where there's no struggle, there's no strength. And I think that's at the heart of warrior energy, the courage to face the darker and more uncomfortable parts of ourselves. So the transformation can begin. I'm going to go down a little path here where I want to bring up the word sloth, one of the seven deadly sins. I discovered a few years ago that sloth isn't about laziness. It's about avoiding tasks and responsibilities and maybe succumbing to distractions. And what's hard today is that we live in a culture that avoids stillness and sort of glorifies busyness. I'm almost put off by how frenzied and distracted I can feel at times. And it seems how everyone around me can feel. And yet I'm just as guilty. Even though I pray and meditate every morning, when I'm done, I have to resist practically sprinting into my day. And I wear myself out. I think the challenge is slowing down long enough to listen and to face really what's inside, that inner battle that I need to refine. So, what do you think happened in our modern society that makes it so difficult to embody a balanced warrior energy?
Well, I'm sure it's a very complex answer if you really tried to parse it all out, but I would lay some of this on feet of what I was talking about earlier of us abandoning the whole idea of initiation and really beginning probably all the way back to the Renaissance, but certainly with the dawning of the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, the industrial revolution, now the information revolution, and then this new thing we're going into, who knows? We've just abandoned all ideas that we need to do things to help people become mature. And so if you're not mature, then you're going to be flying around these archetypes and not being well balanced. If you're lacking in warrior, you will absolutely lack discipline. So you'll be distracted by every shiny object that comes along. And there's no greater example of this as social media. I think everybody should watch that film. It's an old film. It's done 10, 15 years ago. Social media, to get some sense about how manipulated we are with distractions. I mean, honestly, I could go on, do an internet search for some oddball thing like antique sinks from 1920s. And I'll guarantee you, within 10 minutes, I'll be getting ads for antique sink restoration companies. We're tracked everywhere. Everything is bombarding us all the time. And I think we're running. I'm reminded of Malidoma Somé, the wonderful African shaman who came here to teach back in the 1980s. He was sent here by his elders. And when he first came back to discuss Western culture with his elders, he was struggling to try to explain to them the concept of rush hour. And one of the old elders very wisely asked him the question, what are they running from? Because usually in those cultures, if you're running, there's something chasing you. And we might fairly ask that question, what are we running from? We're running from the stillness. Because you get still, your material starts surfacing. We're running from the responsibility and the discipline. Again, like in my interpretation of discipline was self-punishment. Instead of really having the knowledge, which I now do, that discipline leads to more freedom. It's the exact opposite to what we're kind of, our puer puella culture has gone into. We're trying for eternal youth and eternal happiness, eternal distractions. But we're sitting on a whole lot of psychological material that's not been processed. We're sitting on a lot of uncompleted initiations that need to be done. And you'll see it very frequently with these life cycle generated time periods, such as midlife, where almost everybody goes through something, or their spouse goes through it, and then they go through it vicariously with their spouse. Freud called it the return of the repressed. So all these things we didn't do, and we thought were successfully avoiding with our distractions, and then they come hitting home very, very hard. It's also an opportunity, of course, if we've gone through some of these crises, to turn them into opportunities. So I think we're avoiding a lot of things. Grief would be one of them. Our grief rituals have degenerated into jokes. I mean, they're not even remotely close to what true grief principles are about, because grief is actually an initiatory process. You're supposed to go through grief fully and come out on the other side with a changed sense of self. So there's a lot that can be said about this loss of warrior in terms of discipline, in terms of calmness. The place of calmness is the warrior. If you're not connected to warrior, you won't be calm. You'll be full of anxiety. What assuages anxiety? Distractions. So everything that comes along that can distract you, that's the way to make money these days. And every day we're hit with something new, some new thing we're supposed to be chasing. Whereas the ability to sit, to meditate, to self-reflect deeply, we don't have any defense against the anxiety that goes along with that. And even the process of going from, like I said earlier, if you're in the opposite energy of the lover and you start trying to go toward the warrior, let's say you've been very, very codependent and you just learn about all this stuff we're talking about and you decide you're going to start trying to become warrior, the first thing you run into is your own abandonment fears. So now you're full of anxiety, which causes you to run back into the lover. Then that causes you to act out in some way to assuage the anxiety, and it's either distraction or addiction or something. Instead of going through things, instead of facing things and going through them and learning and growing from the other side, we're running from them. And we're running faster and faster and faster and faster. One of the ways we do it now is with information. It's estimated that a 7-day run of the New York Times, so in other words, if you read the New York Times cover to cover for 7 days, you would have gotten more information in those 7 days than a person was exposed to in their entire lifetime in the 1850s. And now we're constantly wired. I mean, we've got our cell phones with us, we're scrolling. Even you could go into a restaurant, you see four friends have gone to lunch. All four of them are on their phone. It's like we're becoming more and more detached, which causes us more and more anxiety, which causes us more and more. It's just a self-perpetuating kind of loop.
Well, I think the first step is maybe then to simply notice where we've gone numb and or maybe even overly comfortable. The warrior wakes up, I think, for me, when something sacred is worth defending, like our peace, our integrity, our relationship with maybe a higher power of sorts, or family member, or even our own healing. So maybe a good way to start would be to ask yourself, where in my life have I stopped showing up with courage? And it's not about picking a fight, it's about reclaiming that inner strength through maybe some small acts of discipline and stacking those small acts of discipline on top of an already well-formed ritual practice or following through, even when I don't feel like it, because I don't always feel like doing what's right.
Yeah, I totally agree. If you got nothing else out of this, if it made you start waking up and reflecting about where you need to do more boundary work, that would be well worthwhile. Because so much of our communication is done from the victim, persecutor, rescuer place. We don't have the capacity to ask for our needs, so we feel victim, and then we want somebody to rescue us, and when people don't rescue us, we go into persecutor. And there's almost nothing I can't trace to that triangle. It's a very simple model, but the antidote is to get into the adult, and that means very frequently highly connecting with and developing your warrior, because you're going to have to learn how to say no. You're going to have to learn how to protect that sacred, even if it's your peace of mind. And so when you find yourself in a pattern of saying yes to something you really don't, it's not good for you or you don't want to do, you've got to learn how to say no. Just as the addict has to learn how to say no to the urge to go to the liquor store or the dope dealer, you also have to say no to the over busyness. You know, when your work wants you to be on call 24/7, you have to learn to say no. I stop at 5. That's what I'm paid for. I've given you plenty. This is a good deal, but I protect my space. I don't need to do business 24/7. So all this, revolves around the idea that we have developmental processes we need to be facing, and that it is in fact the task of our culture to help us with that. If we leave it to the therapist or the professionals, that's not going to work, because a lot of people don't know about this. This is not therapy. This is just what we should be doing as humans to help each other develop, and especially young people, which we're kind of wholesale abandoning in this sensibility when we don't. Now we have generations of people who have no connection to initiation.
Thank you, James. I have a final closing question, and it's if our culture were to reintegrate the warrior archetype, not through the domination or violence, but through courage, purpose, and service, what might that transformation look like?
Well, I think it would be a far better world than what we have. I think we would have far better relationships. I think we would see much less pathology, not only personal pathology with things like depression, but even cultural pathologies like we have with our politics now. I mean, in truth, we don't even have politics anymore, because that word actually means to meet in the middle. And now what we have is sort of the equivalent of the Chicago Bears versus the Packers mentality. And you have to be able to put anything on a bumper sticker to get it across. So we're not really engaging in true politics anymore. Our relationships suffer. Our relationship with our children suffer. Almost every institution that I can think of in our culture suffers tremendously because we don't have connection to this. So I would envision, I don't mean idealistically, but because we're always going to have some challenges, but it would be a very different world, for example, if we just started teaching people how to set appropriate boundaries. If we started teaching people how to ask cleanly to have their needs met, and teach them that they're not going to get them met all the time, and that's okay, not to have to try to get their needs met by hook and crook and manipulation. I think we'd have a lot more, well, just in general, we'd be a lot more mentally healthy, and certainly might free up some of our just time that we spend on all these compensating distractions for more serious endeavors, serious conversations, more serious engagement with what am I doing here in this lifetime? Am I just supposed to be working and amassing stuff? Or is there some purpose to my life? Is there something bigger I could commit myself to? I think many, many, many people suffer not from psychopathology so much in the form of clinical diagnoses, but just simply loss of meaning. That their life is just flatland, especially once they get to midlife. Is this all there is? But to have a sense of purpose, of the ability to experience joy, to still have awe and wonder about nature, to get up every morning not dreading and having to force yourself to drag yourself to a place you hate and spend a third of your life doing things you don't want to do. We'd have a lot less dysfunction all over the place. So that's kind of my take on it. Again, I know for some people that sounds idealistic. I do believe you would see a radically transformed culture. And it may be this is one of the things, although I would also want to throw in here, I think we have a desperate need to reconnect with the sacred feminine. And we don't do that by killing the masculine. You do that by making the masculine more mature, more powerful to be able to protect the feminine. And I'm not just talking about men and women, I'm talking about the feminine in every man. If you added those two together, that would be a hell of a thing. That's probably the thing that has the potential for saving us. So it's one of the reasons I'm so enthusiastic about this work, because everybody needs to do this work, not just people that qualify for an insurance clinical diagnosis with a therapist. And the places that should know about this often don't. The more people that do understand this and the more conversations we get going with people, the better chance we have of actually having this spread. So,
It's a beautiful vision for our culture. It just keeps me that much more enthusiastic and just motivated to continue to doing this. So thank you for that, James. Yeah.
Thank you. I also want to say too that like it seems like the real integration happens in how we live our daily lives and how we respond when things get hard. And maybe, most importantly, the thing that I've learned is that, we have to go it alone. Warriors train in community. It's important that we surround ourselves with people who we believe are courageous and not necessarily brave, because there is a difference between bravery and courage. Brave is something that's sort of inherent, an inherent strength. And most people don't always have that. Courage is facing, hard things in spite of your fears, and to not always surround myself with other busy people. I want to be reminded of my values so I don't forget. This is really good. Thank you.
it reminds me, and I'm old enough to remember this, of course, but before the days of smartphones, there was a time period in the 1980s when it was really chic for everybody to be carrying around their day planner. And they had elaborate leather ones and decorated ones, but it was seen as you were a real meaningful person if you had a full day planner with stuff falling all out of it, and you had it's like it's just so funny to think about that now, because now we don't see it, but it's all in the smartphone times 100,000. But this idea that we need to be connected is extremely important. And one of the fair criticisms of the Jungian approach is that it has tended to privilege the interpersonal, the more introverted path. My teacher, Robert, tried to balance that out. He was one of the few extroverted Jungians you'll run across, but he also really deeply understood this warrior material. And he realized that we do need to be connected to other people, that this is not solely an inner path. It is inner work. There's a lot of inner work that we have to do, and we have to do it on our own. But we function much, much better with a group. So to surround yourself with positive people who are trying to embody this energy is an incredibly important thing. And it's one of the most healing things I've done. Now, I have done a lot of Jungian work, and a lot of that I love and I privilege myself because I am an introvert. But it's just extremely important, that statement that you made, Maureen. And I really want to acknowledge that.
I found that the more I went inward, the more I also went outward. And my relationship strengthens, and they're a lot healthier just because I can ask for what I need. That was one of my biggest challenges, to ask for my own needs to be met. And it was because of Robert Moore's work doing conscious warrior work. It is so easy just to slip into the old ways if you don't pay attention.
So, for each of us, the challenge is to recognize where the warrior lives within us and act with clarity rather than reaction, and to protect what truly matters. So, thanks for listening to The Shadow Knows. If today's episode spoke to you, we'd love for you to subscribe, give us a share with your friends. Feel free to join us again as we continue to explore the hidden layers of the psyche. And until next time, may you walk gently with your shadow, and may its wisdom guide you home, because remember, the shadow knows.
The shadow knows. Thank you all. Thank you, James.
Thanks,
Bye
James.
bye.
Bye.